Now, the Russia-Ukraine war has entered its second week with Moscow targeting Ukraine's nuclear plants and ports and leaving massive destruction and casualties in its trail. However, cities of Kiev as well as Kharkiv remain under Ukraine's fold as the nation fights off a major offensive by Russia. So, how is it that Ukraine is funding its military operations as it tries to combat Russia? Let's take a look at some of the means by which Ukraine is raising capital. The Ukrainian government has raised somewhere around $270 million by the sale of war bonds in local Ukrainian currency on the 1st of March. What are these war bonds? Well, governments in times of war and crisis sometimes appeal to the patriotism of their citizens to cover their financing gap. Now, they're typically sold to retail investors at home, but Ukraine has also managed to sell some of these war bonds to local institutional investors. Now, the important point to note that the returns on these kind of investments are fairly low for the kind of risk that investors are undertaking. Now, for the Ukrainian bond, it carried an interest rate or a yield of 11% for creditors to lend their money for a period of 1 year. Now, on the face of it, it looks pretty lucrative. However, that's not the case because the inflation rate in Ukraine currently stands at about 10%, and the possibility or the chances of Ukraine repaying these interest rates or repaying these bond payments are fairly low as Russia advances further into the nation. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian government is also looking at diversifying these war bonds by issuing them in other currencies like euros and dollars in a bid to tap into the patriotism of Ukrainians abroad. Through history, war bonds are sold to raise rapid funds to fund military operations and other emergencies. Britain most famously sold the National War Bond to fund its participation in the First World War, while the US also sold Liberty War Bonds during the First World War and defense war bonds during the Second World War. Donations in cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin and Ethereum have been flooding Ukraine ever since the war began last week. In fact, the country has also started accepting donations in Dogecoin, and this did come as a leg up for most of these cryptocurrencies. If you see, the value of Dogecoin had at one point exceeded the value of the Russian ruble, which mind you has been crashing ever since the West has unleashed a wave of sanctions against Moscow. Now, ever since the war began on the 24th of February, crypto assets, over 100,000 crypto assets donations totaling $54.7 million have come into Ukraine. In fact, the Ukrainian government has also announced that it will be issuing NFTs in a bid to fund its armed forces as cryptocurrency emerges as one of the most popular means of supporting the Kiev government. Now, what exactly is an NFT? Well, NFT is a non-fungible token that confers the ownership of a digital item upon its buyer. Now, this digital item could be a virtual digital art that has emerged as one of the most popular when it comes to NFTs. The ownership is recorded on a digital decentralized ledger known as blockchain. Even as cryptocurrencies opens up a new path to cash for Ukraine that is fighting off a major offensive by Russia, the kind of cash coming in, it pales in comparison to the kind of cash coming in from its international allies like the US. In addition to authorizing a $350 million aid for Ukraine, the Biden administration has asked the US Congress for $10 billion worth of emergency aid to bolster the humanitarian supplies, the security forces and the economies of Ukraine and its European allies. US aid in addition has also released somewhere around $54 million towards humanitarian aid for Kiev. In addition to that, the Ukrainian government is also in talks with the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank to raise further funds.